The text becomes shorter, the energy fades, the explanations stop, and one day the person who once gave you endless chances becomes unreachable, like a locked room with no door. Because here's the terrifying truth most people never understand. An empath leaves long before they actually leave. In behavioral psychology, this is called emotional withdrawal. It happens when the brain recognizes repeated emotional danger and begins shutting down attachment pathways to protect itself. The same neural circuits involved in physical pain activate during emotional betrayal. Research from the University of Michigan found that rejection and emotional hurt stimulate the anterior cingulate cortex, the exact same area activated during physical injury. To an empath, toxic behavior doesn't just hurt feelings. Their brain experiences it almost like bodily damage. And once the nervous system decides someone is unsafe, something irreversible begins. At first, the empath tries harder. They communicate. They explain. They forgive things they should never forgive. They carry conversations alone. They overanalyze every interaction, trying to restore emotional peace. Because empaths are often conflict-averse, not because they're weak, but because they feel everything intensely. Studies on mirror neurons suggest highly empathetic people process others' emotions almost as if they are experiencing them personally. That means arguments exhaust them faster. Negativity drains them deeper. Coldness cuts sharper. But here's where most people make the fatal mistake. They confuse patience with permanence. They think, they'll always be here. They care too much to leave. They'll forgive me again. Then that is exactly how people lose empaths forever. Because every ignored feeling becomes emotional evidence. Every betrayal becomes data. Every disrespectful moment gets silently recorded inside the nervous system. Empaths rarely explode without warning. They fade after accumulation. Psychologists call this cumulative emotional overload. It's what happens when stress hormones like cortisol remain elevated for too long due to unresolved emotional tension. Over time, the empath's brain shifts from attachment mode into self-protection mode, and once that switch happens, something cold begins replacing their compassion, clarity. Suddenly, they stop defending your behavior. Stop making excuses for you. Stop trying to heal what only you can heal. This is the stage people never notice because the empath still looks calm, but internally, the bond is dying. And here's the most dangerous part. When an empath finally stops reacting, it usually means they've already detached emotionally. The silence isn't weakness. It's closure happening in real time. Neuroscience shows that emotional burnout changes behavior dramatically. A person who once chased connection begins avoiding stimulation entirely. The empath who once sent paragraphs now responds with one sentence. The person who once begged to fix things suddenly seems indifferent. Not because they stopped caring overnight, because caring became too expensive psychologically. There's a phrase a therapist often use. The opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference, and nothing is more frightening than an empath becoming indifferent. Because when they truly detach, they rarely come back the same. You see, empaths have an unusually high tolerance for pain, not because they enjoy suffering, but because they constantly prioritize understanding over self-preservation. They try to see the wounded child, I, we, and everyone. The hidden trauma, the insecurity behind bad behavior. But eventually, the brain asks one brutal question, who is protecting me? And when the answer becomes no one, the empath changes. This transformation is psychological survival. The nervous system begins reducing emotional investment to conserve energy. The empath stops volunteering their heart where it is repeatedly mishandled. And the shocking part, most people only realize the empath mattered after the emotional supply disappears. Because empaths give things modern psychology identifies as core human emotional needs: validation, safety, presence, deep listening, emotional regulation. They calm rooms without people noticing. They absorb tension others create. They emotionally carry relationships in silence. Most people think an empath leaves because of one final argument, one betrayal, one moment of disrespect. But psychology reveals something much darker. Empaths almost never leave because of one event. They leave because their nervous system can no longer survive the accumulation. Every ignored feeling, every broken promise, every moment they felt emotionally abandoned while standing right beside someone they loved. The brain remembers all of it. Science now shows the human nervous system records emotional pain with frightening precision. Researchers using brain imaging discovered that social rejection activates the same neural circuitry as physical injury. The anterior cingulate cortex, the region associated with physical pain, lights up when someone feels emotionally rejected. To an empath, repeated emotional hurt is not drama. It is biological stress. And the terrifying part is the damage compounds silently. Empaths are often highly sensitive processors. Their brains absorb emotional environments like sponges absorb water. Studies on sensory processing sensitivity suggest certain people react more intensely to emotional stimuli, conflict, and tension. Their cortisol levels spike faster. Their emotional recovery takes longer. This means what another person casually dismisses an empath may carry for weeks. One cold sentence, one humiliating moment, one night of emotional neglect. It stays inside their nervous system long after everyone else forgets it happened. But empaths rarely speak about the damage immediately. Instead, they do something psychological we call lead dangerous. They rationalize it. He's stressed out. She didn't mean it. They've been through a lot. And while they continue understanding everyone else, nobody realizes the empath is slowly disappearing internally because emotional overload does not happen like an explosion. It happens like water filling a locked room, slowly, silently, until there is no oxygen left. The human body was never designed to remain under chronic emotional stress. When someone constantly feels emotionally unsafe, the brain increases production of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this affects memory, immune function, digestion, sleep quality, and even heart health. Harvard researchers have linked prolonged emotional stress to inflammation throughout the body. Inflammation that silently damages organs, weakens immunity, accelerates aging. This means some empaths are not simply emotionally tired. Their bodies are physically deteriorating from carrying emotional pain no one can see. And the tragedy is they usually hide it well. They still smile, still help people, still answer calls, still show up for everyone, while internally their nervous system is screaming, "We Angie," for relief. That is why empaths often seem fine right before they disappear forever. The breakdown happened long before the exit. Psychologists call this emotional exhaustion syndrome. It occurs when a person becomes psychologically depleted from prolonged emotional labor and unresolved stress. The brain eventually begins shutting down emotional responsiveness to survive. And this is the moment people misunderstand empaths the most, because suddenly the empath changes. The person who once over-explained becomes quiet. The person who once fought for the relationship stops arguing completely. The person who once cried now stares blankly in silence. Most people think the empath stopped caring. In reality, the nervous system is entering survival mode. There is a frightening psychological phenomenon called learned helplessness. It occurs when repeated emotional failure convinces the brain that effort no longer changes outcomes. After enough disappointment, the empath unconsciously stops trying, not because they are weak, because the brain believes more effort will only create more pain. That's why the final stage before an empath leaves is often emotional numbness. And numbness is dangerous because when someone reaches the point where pain no longer shocks them, detachment begins feeling peaceful. At first, the empath still hopes things will change. They communicate carefully. They explain their feelings gently. They beg for emotional honesty. They ask for consistency, for reassurance, for respect, not because they are needy, because emotional security is a biological need. Neuroscientists have found that stable emotional connection regulates the nervous system itself. Healthy relationships lower blood pressure, reduce stress hormones, and improve emotional resilience. But toxic emotional inconsistency does the opposite. One day affection, next day coldness. One moment intimacy, next moment rejection. This creates something psychologists call intermittent reinforcement, one of the most psychologically addictive emotional patterns in existence. It's the same reward mechanism involved in gambling addiction. The unpredictability traps the empath emotionally. They keep hoping the loving version of the person will return permanently, but eventually their nervous system burns out from the instability. And once burnout arrives, something changes permanently. The empath stops expecting love to feel safe. That realization breaks something deep inside them. Imagine waking up one day and realizing the person you defended the most is also the person exhausting your nervous system the most. That realization changes people forever, because empaths can survive pain. What destroys them is realizing their love is being mishandled repeatedly by someone fully aware of their sensitivity. And once that awareness enters the empath's mind, emotional withdrawal accelerates rapidly. The text becomes shorter. The eye contact changes. The warmth disappears slowly, not out of revenge, out of preservation. Research on trauma responses shows that emotional withdrawal is often the brain's attempt to reduce psychological danger. The empath is unconsciously trying to stop further emotional injury. This is why many empaths isolate after prolonged toxic relationships. Their nervous system becomes hypersensitive. Loud environments exhaust them. Conversations drain them. Even small conflicts feel overwhelming. Their body has spent too long in fight or flight mode. And here is the most heartbreaking part. Many empaths blame themselves while this is happening. They think they are too emotional, too sensitive, too difficult to love, when in reality their brain is reacting exactly how a human nervous system reacts to prolonged emotional stress. The empath was not weak, they were overloaded, and overload changes people. Studies show chronic emotional stress can shrink the hippocampus, the brain region linked to memory and emotional regulation. It can increase anxiety disorders, panic attacks, insomnia, and depression. Some empaths are literally becoming sick, trying to maintain relationships that continuously wound them emotionally. That is why the disappearance eventually becomes necessary, not dramatic, necessary. The empath reaches a terrifying internal realization. If I stay here, I will lose myself completely. And when survival finally becomes stronger than attachment, they leave quietly, not because they stopped loving, but because the body eventually forces the soul to choose between connection and survival always wins in the end. That is why the people who lose empaths are often left stunned. They say things like, "You changed. You became cold. You gave up too early." Silently. But they never saw the invisible psychological war happening inside the empath for months, sometimes years. They never saw the sleepless nights, the anxiety attacks, the emotional overthinking, the silent crying behind closed doors. They only noticed the empath leaving, not the slow destruction that made leaving necessary. And by the time the empath finally walks away, something irreversible has already happened. The nervous system has learned one brutal lesson. Peace is safer than attachment. And once an empath truly learns that lesson, they rarely return to the people who taught it to them. The most dangerous moment in a relationship is not the screaming, not the arguments, not even the betrayal. It is the silence. Because when an empath goes silent, something psychological has already died inside them. Most people completely misunderstand this stage. They think the empath is calming down, giving space, taking time to think. But neuroscience suggests something much deeper is happening. The human brain can only tolerate emotional disappointment for so long before it begins protecting itself through detachment. And for empaths, that detachment rarely happens loudly. It happens quietly, gradually. Like a candle losing oxygen in a sealed room, at first the empath reacts emotionally because they still believe the connection can be saved. They explain themselves repeatedly. They communicate with patience. They overanalyze every conflict, searching for emotional resolution. Why? Because highly empathetic people often possess stronger emotional monitoring systems. Studies involving mirror neurons suggest empaths process the emotions of others with extraordinary intensity. Their nervous systems absorb emotional tension faster and deeper than most people realize. That means arguments don't just upset them, they exhaust them biologically. One cold interaction can replay inside their mind for days. One dismissive comment can trigger hours of emotional processing. Their brain searches endlessly for emotional safety because emotional harmony feels necessary for survival. But eventually something terrifying begins happening inside the empath's nervous system. They stop believing their feelings matter. And psychology has a name for this: emotional learned helplessness. It occurs when repeated emotional invalidation teaches the brain, We at expressing pain changes nothing. So, the nervous system adapts by shutting down emotional output altogether. That's why an empath becoming quiet is never random. Silence is often the final stage of emotional exhaustion. The empath realizes, no matter how clearly I explain my pain, nothing changes. And once the brain reaches that conclusion, behavior changes dramatically. The paragraphs disappear. The late-night conversations stop. The emotional vulnerability fades. Suddenly, the person who once begged to fix things barely reacts anymore. This confuses people deeply because humans expect pain to look emotional, but the deepest pain often looks emotionally empty. Research in trauma psychology shows that emotional numbing is a protective defense mechanism. When stress becomes overwhelming, the brain reduces emotional responsiveness to minimize further psychological damage. This means the empath's silence is not peace, it is survival. And the most chilling part, by the time this silence appears externally, the emotional bond may already be collapsing internally, because empaths rarely detach impulsively. They detach after prolonged emotional disappointment. Every broken promise becomes neurological evidence. Every invalidated feeling weakens trust pathways in the brain. Every moment of emotional neglect quietly trains the nervous system to stop expecting safety from that person. Over time, the empath stops reacting, not because they don't care, but because caring became psychologically dangerous. Think about that. Imagine loving someone so deeply that your nervous system eventually identifies that love is a source of stress that changes a human being permanently. Studies show chronic emotional stress increases cortisol production. When cortisol remains elevated too long, it affects memory, concentration, sleep, digestion, immune function, and even cardiovascular health. This means some empaths are not just emotionally hurt. Their bodies are physically responding to relational instability as if surviving a long-term threat. And eventually, the nervous system starts conserving energy. This is when silence becomes addictive. No more explaining, no more emotional chasing, no more fighting to be understood. The empath discovers something shocking. Silence hurts less than disappointment, and once they discover that emotional detachment accelerates rapidly, people often mistake this phase for emotional coldness. But emotionally exhausted people are not cold, they are depleted. The empath once cared so intensely that they ignored their own psychological limits. They tolerated inconsistency, mixed signals, emotional neglect, disrespect disguised as misunderstanding, because they kept hoping empathy would eventually heal the relationship. But empathy without reciprocity becomes self-destruction. And the human nervous system eventually rebels against self-destruction. That rebellion looks like distance. Suddenly, the empath no longer reacts to arguments, no longer begs for reassurance, no longer asks for honesty. Why? Because emotionally they are already grieving the relationship while still inside it. Psychologists describe grief as the process of emotionally adapting to loss. What many people never realize is this. Empaths often begin grieving long before the relationship ends. They mourn the emotional connection slowly, silently, internally. Every disappointment becomes another funeral for the version of the relationship they once believed in. And eventually the silence arrives. Not as punishing, meant as acceptance. This is why the empath's final silence feels so haunting, because there's no visible explosion attached to it. One day they simply stop reaching emotionally. And that moment terrifies people, not because of what the empath says, but because of what they no longer say. No more emotional effort, no more attempts to repair, no more visible attachment, just stillness. And stillness is psychologically unsettling because humans instinctively fear emotional withdrawal. Attachment theory shows that emotional connection creates feelings of safety and identity. When someone emotionally withdraws, the brain perceives relational danger immediately. That's why people suddenly panic once the empath goes silent. Ironically, they often begin caring hardest only after the empath emotionally detaches. Now they want communication. Now they want honesty. Now they notice the emotional absence, but the empath's nervous system may already be gone. And this is the brutal truth people struggle to accept. An empath's silence is usually the result of repeated emotional injuries that were ignored when they were still speaking. That's what makes the silence tragic, because see, the empath tried again and again and again until the brain finally chose peace over connection. Neuroscience confirms that emotional burnout changes personality temporarily. A once warm, expressive person may become detached, withdrawn, and emotionally unavailable after prolonged stress exposure. This is not manipulation. It is nervous system fatigue. The brain literally loses the energy required for emotional engagement. And once an empath reaches this stage, solitude often becomes healing. Quiet rooms feel safer than conversations. Distance feels safer than intimacy. Isolation feels safer than vulnerability, because their nervous system associates attachment with exhaustion now. That's why the empath's silence can feel colder than anger. Anger still contains emotional investment. Silence often means the investment is disappearing. And once emotional investment disappears completely, the relationship becomes psychologically difficult to revive. The empath may still care about the person, but they no longer trust the connection. And trust is everything. Research consistently shows that emotional trust regulates human attachment security. Without trust, the nervous system remains hyper-vigilant, constantly scanning for emotional danger. No human being can live peacefully inside constant hypervigilance forever. Eventually, the body demands escape. That's when the empath finally disappears emotionally, not because they wanted to stop loving, but because their nervous system could no longer survive loving without safety. And the heartbreaking part is this: most people only understand the empath's silence after it's too late to reverse it. Because silence is not where the damage started. Silence is where the damage finally became irreversible. By then, the empath has already exhausted every emotional resource trying to save the connection. Now, they are no longer fighting for love. They are fighting for inner peace. And once an empath begins choosing peace over emotional chaos, their silence becomes permanent. Not loud, not cruel, just final.